When a culture faces profound change, what endures? What emerges when traditions are interrupted? When familiar ways of expression are replaced by new ideologies? In Mongolia of the 1930s, as Buddhist monasteries were dismantled and ancient practices set aside, artists navigated a complex reality, adapt to the official aesthetic of socialism, or find alternative paths forward. From this period of cultural transformation, something meaningful emerged. Not just adaptation, but a thoughtful response that honored the past while engaging with a changing present. Today, our search brings us into a conversation about art as a carrier of identity, about creativity as a form of memory, and about how visual expression can preserve what might otherwise be forgotten. We'll explore how art becomes a space where different values and visions can coexist, sometimes in tension, and sometimes in harmony. We're joined by a woman whose life connects directly to this history, whose father was an influential artist during Mongolia's socialist period, and who has herself become a bridge between worlds. From Berkeley to Venice, from Shanghai to Indianapolis, she has brought important stories to light, addressing the absence of Mongolian art in Western institutions. Her work shows us how creative responses to yesterday's challenges speak to our contemporary global questions: environmental sustainability, cultural recognition, and the effects of economic systems on creative expression. It invites us to see how art moves beyond borders and time, offering fresh perspectives on our connections with each other and with the world we share. This is a conversation about seeing what has often been overlooked, about valuing what continues despite significant change, and about how bringing art to new audiences can transform our understanding. Dr. Sultan, I am so honored to have you on the show today. I've been looking forward to this for the past couple of months, knowing that I would have the opportunity to talk to you about the work that you do, both in art history, but also in contemporary curatorial practices. In my research, I saw that you grew up in a family of artists. Your father was an artist. Your your siblings are all practicing artists. I'm curious, how far back does that go in your family? Was it your father and his practice that kind of grew that artistic sensibility for your family, or was there people before that in your lineage where that kind of spoke to your father as well?
Well, thank you very much, John, for bringing me to this program. It's my honor too, and such a pleasure to be here and having this opportunity to talk to you. Um, so, my family history about art actually goes to my ancestors in 14th century, where we have a little bit of information, not too much, that one of our ancestors was a smith person, metalsmith, precisely. And after that, we have a gap of knowledge. We don't know exactly what our lineage people are doing. And I know that my grandparents, they were not. I don't know much about the artistic activities. And my father was as a young man, he began in music actually. He was planning some music instruments and dancing and stuff like that. And it was the time when the first theater was formed in 1930s. And he
Hmm.
was a young lad in his late teens and performing, dancing and singing in that theater. And then after that, um, he was called to help with some painting. And what he told us is that that painting was happening for one of the early movies about a historical period. And it was shot together as a joint production with Soviet filmmakers. But it was a Mongolian movie, it's a Mongolian production happening, taking place in Mongolia, about Mongolian historical period, theme, and Mongolian actors. And so he, as a young man, he was called to paint some design sketches, some drawings for like accessories, like swords or armor or hats or whatever
Yeah.
was necessary. And there weren't too many people who could do something around art. And so he was called to do that. And somehow he felt more interested now drawing rather than music playing. And
Hmm.
that's how his career shaped as we know from him.
How interesting. Was there a moment in your own childhood, similar to your father, where you knew that you were going to be drawn to the art world in whatever capacity?
It's a very interesting question. It sounds so a simple question, but it's such a deep question too, because I feel like it was like my karma, my destiny, and some sort because I grew up in very much in an artist family, surrounded by brushes and drawings and art journals, and I had two older brothers, older sister, all artists. My father was an artist. My mom was not an artist. She was a teacher. And so I grew up like listening and talking about art all the time, or exhibitions, and seeing, producing art and stuff like that. But I never was particularly drawn myself to make art. However, when I was in school, in elementary and then, middle and high school, I was very good in languages and writing. I was drawn to humanities, to literature and languages. And that somehow, navigated me towards art history and to Hungary, to Budapest, when I was 18 years old. And so, and at the time, it was a socialist time, 1983. And so we all were, fully paid with fellowship to study in a college. So that was like system for everyone at the time. And we would be given opportunities to different schools based on our interests.
Hmm.
So, and somehow my year when I was taking exams to go to college, somehow that art history program was available to me. And I remember choosing it and just going there because it involved writing. Right? So I was good at writing. I was interested in writing. And I remember there was also possibility to become a reporter, a journalist. So there was, but between the two, I chose rather art history than thinking about my interest in writing and humanities.
To my understanding, art history is, or was at least, a primarily Western sort of idea. I'm curious what sort of drew you back. Was there always this thought that you would be studying art history of Mongolia, or was it originally, Western Italian Renaissance art, or was there something else before that?
So at the time when I was a college, so the whole country was under Soviet influence. Dependent on Soviet Union as economically, and much of understanding of art and institutions of art like exhibitions and museums all came from Soviet Union. And many artists were trained in Soviet Union, Moscow. My father was trained in Moscow, or fewer artists were trained in Eastern Europe.
Hmm.
So art history is one of those disciplines. As you rightly pointed out, it's a Western discipline and sort of became familiar in Mongolian art scene through Soviet influence. And there were a couple of art historians who were trained in Moscow in art academy. But myself, when I was studying in Budapest, it was a Western discipline. So we were studying medieval art, Renaissance, catacombs, yeah, all Christian art. And I remember myself because I grew up in the Soviet period in socialist times, and there was no any possibility for any of us to learn about religion, any religion, right?
Yeah.
Anything included. So I remember myself being in a classroom in Budapest in art history, looking at Christian biblical scenes, right, from Italy, for instance, and have no idea what they do. what they were showing. I remember the kind of puzzlement, right? And I was the only Mongolian there. All my peers were all Hungarians who grew up in the Christian society. And I befriended a girl from Greece who was another international student there. And I remember Eva was her name, and Eva would tell me after the class what those biblical scenes mean
That's awesome.
and about Bible and all that. And that's how I was introduced to Bible and started reading it just to understand art. Um, and I remember how, interested I was, excited. Wow, it's just such an interesting story.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So there
Um,
was no question about studying Mongolian at the time. It was all about European and Christian mostly until I got a third year student when we started to learn about modern art and contemporary art.
what a gift to have someone local like that to kind of help guide you through those sort of conversations of symbolism and meaning and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm curious. Mongolia is a landlocked country, and it's situated on a steppe or a plateau
Hmm.
between these two major political forces in the world,
Hmm.
Russia and the People's Republic of China. Um,
Hmm.
how did that influence the art making and the art practice in Mongolia?
It is a interesting geopolitical political positioning of Mongolia,
Yeah.
sandwiched between the two gigantic nations. Um, but interestingly, Mongolian art and culture is very different from any of those neighbors, especially from China. And this is because Mongolia, first of all, weather, climate, it's very continental, it's very dry, it's
Mhm.
elevated above the sea level, and it's rigid. It gets very cold during winters to minus 20 easily Celsius degree and stuff like that. But it is also very sunny country. So I believe the data was showing it's over 300, about 250 to 300 days a year it's sunny.
Wow.
So it gets snow winter, but it's always sunny. So these elements made the habitat of Mongolian nomads, right, who living with their sustained economy of cattle breeding, um, be very different in terms of culture, art making practices, because it necessitated them to be very close to nature, understanding nature, and production such as, for instance, in China, silk making, right, was not possible in Mongolia because just because
Right.
it's called of a country to wear silk, right? And so instead of that, leather making became practice. And so making big coats developed very early, even before rising of the Mongols in the 1200s. And boots, for instance, all that kind of material culture developed in relationship of what was their climate was, right? What was necessary for the people and what kind of habitat they had. And it was always based on animals, cattle breeding, nomadism, and very different from agriculture-based economies such it was China.
To my understanding, Buddhism plays a large role in the cultural context and history of Mongolia. How does that influence and how does that kind of play into some of the art practices?
Hmm. Hmm. So Buddhism came to Mongolia um, to different stages. So during pre-Mongols, what we call pre-Mongols is during the period of Silk Road and before rising of the Mongols in the 1200s with Genghis Khan as their leader. Buddhism was also came to the nomadic people who lived in the territory of Mongolia through Silk Road, and then during Mongol imperial period in 1300s, through the alliance of the Mongol Khans, Kublai Khan specifically, with Tibetan monks, and then later, again through alliance, political interest of becoming allies, Mongols and Tibetan monks. So Tibet and Mongolia became very close allies since 1300s, and so the form that Mongols adopted and practice even today is the form of Tibetan Buddhism, but because its appropriation happened through the Mongol lands, Mongol perspectives, the scholars now in the past decade, we call this as a Mongolian Buddhism. And Buddhism has a very profound influence on entire culture, on architecture, building temples, monasteries, and every temple and monastery had its own workshop of art making, and developing different ritual objects and rituals that involve paintings and sculptures. And to this day, Buddhism has most profound influence on Mongolian art and living.
What are some of those rituals? I'm curious. And is there any sort of relationship to land and in the environment with that?
Yes. With and without Buddhism, Mongolia is very, very spiritual around the nature. So, similar to some Asian countries, Mongolians always believe that different elements of nature have their own spirits. And this belief in spirits, it's not necessarily connected with Buddhism, but it's also very indigenous beliefs, shamanic beliefs, or ancestral beliefs. And so, mountains, for instance, we believe that there are spirits, right? In the mountains, or rivers have their own spirits. And so people's living is living with all these spirits around. They are naked, they're invisible to us, but it doesn't mean they do not exist. And so nomads develop these different types of rituals around those spirits and respect towards nature. And some of this might remind you indigenous practices in the United States of Native Americans,
Yeah,
right? Um,
yeah, I was going to
yeah,
mention that.
yeah, exactly. And so aspersions of milk, for instance, is very, very widespread among Mongols, where fresh milk you asperse to sky, um, as a connection between sky and earth and to your ancestors. Then there are rituals of cairns of stones on top of different hills, and you circumambulate the cairns of stones 3 times again to respect that particular locale, that particular hill and mountain, because again, we're just some beings among surrounded with others, and we have to acknowledge their presence and give our respect. And it's just simple things like milk or cairns of stones. But it's all very profound. So when you
Yeah.
go to Mongolia, you see those cairns of stones, piled either in small or big formations on various mountains everywhere in the country.
I'm thinking about this idea of nomadism and the relationship with Buddhism and impermanence. And I know that you did your thesis on a particular Buddhist temple
Mhm.
that whenever I was learning about it, it was the first time I'd ever known of a temple that moved. And I
Mhm.
was just kind of blown away by that. And I'm curious if you could kind of talk more about that, um, why that was and how it came about.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's a very interesting case, because not only temple moved, but it grew, expanded in its architecture, and
Mm,
it was kind of organic settlement. The different temples were added, and it was surrounded also, or accompanied by merchant communities. and it moved very large distances. It moved
Yeah.
from northern border to south border, all within the central part of Mongolia, over 30 times. And we have records of them in texts, which it's talking about now it's the time to move, and there will be, 30 camels needed to move because we need to now dismantle our yurts and tents and start moving because pastures are not fresh anymore. The land needs to be, renewed. So it was different aspects. There are different reasons why that monastery moved. And it's one of them is looking for new pastures because the monastery, the monks owned also cattle. Were also herders.
Right.
And so they always needed new rangelands where these animals could sustain their fresh habitat. There were other reasons is also another respect for nature is that you don't stay in one place because you're ruining the nature this way. And you have to move so that the nature also kind of rejuvenates itself. And the third is political reasons. The
Mhm.
first one it started as a moving temple because the main ruler for whom a yurt was erected by his parents. He was only 5 year old. He became known as a reincarnation and an important teacher, so monk, and a ruler. And so he was purged by other ethnic Mongol communities who didn't believe that he was actually the ruler and didn't believe that he should be leading the Mongol people, the central Mongol people. And so they purged him. And when he established several monasteries. And one monastery, for instance, we know pretty much from the records in 1680s, it was burnt. And he had to flee, take his people and completely, hide away from those purging enemies. And it was completely burned. And in the past few years, there were archaeological expeditions unearthing that burnt monastery and finding many, many clay sculptures that he made in 1680s. So the third reason was there was this political one where he couldn't stay in one place because there were enemies, and so he had to also constantly stay itinerant. And the monastery stopped moving in mid 1800s because it was just became very large. And the rulers now, the reincarnations of that first man, they were Tibetans,
Mm.
and it was just so much uh, of architecture there that it became impossible physically to move, and they were very small movements, if there were, just in the area where modern day capital city of Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar, is located. So it's a valley or between the four mountains. So it was just settled there in late 19th century and later became a Mongol capital city.
It's so cool to see how necessity kind of creates inventions like that.
Mhm.
Um, I know that you're the first curator of Mongolian art, which that's amazing. How has the practice in Mongolia changed from traditional practices in art making? And I guess things maybe started picking up more or changing in once the Soviets kind of left this country alone a little bit. I don't know as much as you do, obviously. So,
Mhm.
do you have examples of those sorts of pieces of art?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, so the past century during the socialist period, when young artists Mongolian artists were trained by Soviet teachers in Moscow, Leningrad, currently St. Petersburg, and other cities and Eastern Europe. Um, there was mostly mainstream was socialist realism, And new genres were introduced to Mongolia, such as landscape, for instance, because Mongolia was prior to socialism, prior to Soviet influence, it was basically a very Buddhist country, and art was mostly Buddhist. And so this past century developed um, modern art through such medium as watercolor and oil on canvas and sculpture and stuff like that. Now, the idea of curating is really Western concept as well. Curatorial practice was not known in the past century because the exhibitions were developed by the artists themselves. And all over the socialist bloc, there were countries had so-called union of all artists, right? All artists associations developed where again their funding was available for the artists, and this organization was very funded from the government and from their own activities, and they were helping with gallery spaces, with studio spaces, and even payments, even salarying the artists. So artists were salaried people in the past century. And curatorial practice became um, introduced to Mongolia when Mongolia, as you mentioned, sort of became a democratic nation in 1992. And from that on, all the Western conceptual ideas of art, such as installations or performance and video art, all of that became sort of slowly
Mm.
coming to Mongolia with opening of Mongolia to the world. It's not being isolated as a socialist country. And with that curatorial practice, and I am credited with introducing curatorial practice because as early as 1993, I remember that I was a young graduate of art school, art historian, graduate from art school, and I was in sort of called to do some organize exhibitions at different embassies. That's how it started. So there was German embassy, and there was American embassy, and our embassy of the United States that at the time was very public space. At the time, there were no sort of fortunately, there was no terrorist activities around the world that are
Yeah.
threatening embassies, and so and Embassy of the United States was most public space, and there was no fences around, and there was a huge library. That's how I used to go to library. I was already very fluent with speaking English at the time, befriending public officers of the embassy staff, whose mission was to create the connection, cultural relations with the country, with their where they were. And I was frequenting Embassy of the United States, for instance, in 1990s, and they had public officer had a space like a little conference room where they wanted to have exhibitions. And so, of course, I was called, and I started to have exhibitions there. And the same with German embassy, they had a very beautiful space where they had regular exhibitions, and they just didn't want to do them, all by themselves. They wanted someone from the country to do that, and I became sort of curator, introducing that practice, and that's how I started. And then it followed in 1997 when I was in Japan. I had a very large show of over hundreds, over a dozen of artists,
Oh,
because I
wow.
received the funding from a company, and they wanted to have. It was a beautiful building that company had designed by Michael Graves, and very postmodernist with beautiful, colors, very different colors. As you know, Michael Graves likes different colors in buildings,
Yeah.
and they had communities doing different activities there. And so, since I was there, I applied for it. I won the award, and I did exhibition of Mongolian art, and that became my first curatorial exhibition outside of Mongolia in 1997.
Oh, wow. What led up to you the exhibition with the Zurich style of paintings. I
Mhm.
know that your father was a, a painter and a major proponent of that style, but I'm curious, how did that kind of play into critiquing modern society?
Mhm, mhm. So I think this would be a good time for me to, if it's possible, to share my screen and show some
Please do.
art.
I
Let's
think that's
do
a great
this.
idea.
Uh, and hopefully you can see some images there.
I believe so. Yep.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
So
Yep.
here's, for instance, one painting by my father, and it's called uh, call, or appeal is another word, and it's basically showing a revolutionary man
Oh,
um, blowing a conch, but
yeah.
the style that it takes on is very different from socialist realism, even though the subject matter showing
Right.
like red colors and it's a red, soldier, but
Yeah.
the elements, the flames and the flat horse that it's showing, it's very decorative and it's taking actually all boring from Buddhist art. And so this Mongol Durak was developed as a new style by my father and his colleagues, different artists who were not very concerned about the dominating socialist realism. They wanted heritage, they wanted the traditional traditions, still kind of being visible, and because the Buddhist art and Buddhism was completely destroyed and not possible, they borrowing the motifs in a subtle way, but definitely as a visual kind of resistance towards
Yeah.
or against socialist realism. So the idea of the style was being completely different visually from socialist realism. And so even the medium of making this, they meant to be different. It close to Buddhist art and different from oil and canvas. Even that was sort of part of this idea.
Such an arresting image.
Mhm.
Wow.
So when this became such a kind of success, you still see my screen?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And if I move it to, let's see, or move it to next image. Let's see if it's possible. That became sort of very successful uh, sort of new style Mongol Zurak. And it was intentionally named Mongol Zurak because, again, of
Hmm.
um, kind of thinking about tradition. It's a kind of looking inside of Mongol traditions and
Yeah.
staying away from socialist realism and thinking what Mongolian traditional art would look like. And so the name was also kind of showing that Mongol painting. Durak means painting, Mongol painting. And this was really done by artists in the past century, and then it continues to this day. Continues very successfully to this day, and it's with contemporary artists.
And the horse plays a significant role in Mongolian culture. So I'm assuming that that is representative of Mongolia.
Mhm. Yeah, horse is very liked subject matter. Many artists like horses just because, again, even though, as you mentioned in the beginning of the program, so much of population lives in the city, in the capital city, they still have many family members in countryside. So I
Right.
would say half of the country is still pastoral nomads. So
Right. Right.
it's a city life connected with the countryside life, very much through personal, family members, or you coming from countryside and now deciding to live in the city or something like that. And so there's a constant connection with countryside. If there's no that complete sort of disconnect, there is no, it's always connection. And so even though many artists who live in the capital city, they still like horses. as the image, as the subject matter, because again, horse has culturally is so much importance for the nomads, for their itinerary, for their movement and migration and so on. I don't know if you see this another painting by my father called "Assemble of Clouds" on your screen.
Yeah. This
Yeah.
image, whenever I was doing my research, was the one that really struck me. I took a few minutes just to stare at it.
Mhm.
If you can't see it at the moment, for listeners, there's this huge expanse of clouds and then this little tiny strip of land at the very bottom with a couple of yurts, just to kind of show the scale of humanity in relationship to the universe. And even right now, it's really arresting to me. And it's just one of the most beautiful images I've ever seen.
Yeah. So Mongolia, as I mentioned, very sunny country, and so clouds and sky, it's often blue, very often, very, very blue. And against that blue color, the colors when they take the different shapes and colors, right? That is very constant, what we grew
Hmm.
up seeing. And this is what this art is representing here. The ornamental clouds occupying the entire composition and showing the different nuances, hues of orange and blue and gray and white, and so this becomes is a very large sort of as he calls it, assembly of clouds, right?
Hmm.
But this is very, very also representative of Mongolian landscape and Mongolian understanding of, as I mentioned, of spirituality towards a landscape, understanding how we're living with all these invisible entities and we're just small part of it and we have to respect all that. And clouds is another very frequent sort of subject matter in many artists' work. This one is particularly is very it's in the permanent collection of National Gallery of Mongolia, and it's particularly favored by Mongolians because as a masterpiece, because again Mongol Zorak style, as you can see,
Hmm.
was done during socialist time, 1977, but the way it is showing the clouds is just very different from socialist realism, from European painting. Yeah.
Yeah. What size painting is that? How big is it?
Yeah, it's quite big. I think it's a 1.5 to, it's almost like a square, 1.5,
Mhm.
1.7 meters.
Wow. Oh my gosh, those clouds are huge then.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They're quite big. And unfortunately, on the screen you cannot see, but there are these clouds. The brushwork is very important in Mongol Zorak, where the different sizes of brushes are used, and to create this kind of ornament, right? The line
Yeah.
work, and the line work is very thin and very ornamental. So to create that kind of volume and the layering of those lines to create this ornament is also requires a lot of practice and the talent and learning. One aspect of Mongol Zorak was that in the past century is they creating a new class of Mongol Zorak in art school. So art school has fine art class where European style of art is taught, and alongside there is a class of Mongol Zorak where this traditional medium of art is also taught, and still today it's like this. So, as I mentioned, this Mongol
Oh, yeah.
Zorak is today, and artists such as Bazar Zorik are trained in Mongol Zorak. So they're graduates of this traditional painting class, and so they continue that the kind of flat, decorative but very nuanced color, nuanced line work in their work. But the subject matter is different, and it's about
Yeah.
neoliberalism. It's about commodification of culture, such as in this one. It's called Mickey
Yeah.
Paulo, and he likes the figure of Mickey Mouse, not because he's particularly drawn to Disney. It's just a metaphor for how our culture is commodified and
Yeah.
his Mickey Mouse is usually threatening figure. It's not a jolly and funny figure.
Right,
Um,
right. So it's almost like a Marco Polo play, but it's Mickey Polo,
yeah, it's a
and
Mickey Mouse.
it
Yeah.
seems like there's this level of industrial kind of
Hmm.
aesthetic to it. Some of
Yeah,
the layering to it, and that's really interesting. The
exactly.
the commentary back on contemporary culture, where there's this critique on it. In my
Hmm.
understanding, or at least in my research in art world, that there's always been a critique of things, but maybe it's more so nowadays.
Hmm.
Do you get that as well, or?
Yes, it's very true. So, when I talked to the artist about this, Derek, he's actually um, now represented by a gallery in Dallas, in Texas, Liliana Block Gallery. And he tells me about his concerns, first of all, about commodification of culture in Mongolia, because there's so much, again, influences coming from United States, from East Asia, from Korea, for instance, but it's not sort of taught or it's not organized. And um, that kind of losing of the values um, and being drawn to um, commodity, being drawn to popular culture is something that he is very concerned about. He has himself 3 kids, and I think he sees that in what his kids are doing, and he is concerned about that. And second, as you mentioned, yes, industrial. It's concerned about also neoliberalism. In his case, it also makes questioning about the environmental damage through mining, for instance. Mongolia became very popular among the mining companies around the world because of deposits
Yeah.
of gold and deposits of copper that are found in Mongolia throughout different locations. And at some point in early 2000s, there are so many companies came from Australia and Canada and China, all with the aim of mining, and they were destroying the nature. And there were no regulations at that time. Angola was new to mining business, and so there were no regulations to repair their environment when the mining is done. And so many rivers were damaged, and many rangelands were damaged, and it is destroying the life of pastoral nomads essentially. And so it's extremely, extremely concerning, and it continues to be concerned. And Bhattacharya shows that in these paintings a lot.
Do you think, as artists, there's a responsibility to make those comments like that?
Yes, it's that they kind of critiquing or expressing their concerns through specifically directing them towards political entities or business entities began in around 2008 with this artist Basanger, who started to show
Mm.
political figures in his art. So he would take a Buddhist theme with a Buddha image in the middle, but they were
Wow.
surrounded by non divinities as usual in Buddhist art, which we see, but with people in black cars and suits, who for him would be, allegorical figures of political corruption or political instability, political rulers, and corporations who are responsible for the damaging of environment because they're doing mining and they're not repairing it. And so from him, Battleser continued this, and many artists now are doing this. This one is by Numbing, for instance, a woman artist who is showing a Maitreya Buddha. And Maitreya Buddha is very Panasian, very famous entity in Buddhism because it's a Buddha of picture. And Maitreya is sitting in this composition above a very gray sort of cityscape. And why is it so gray and so
Hmm.
sad? Because it's
Wow.
polluted, it's air pollution. And now Ulaanbaatar is one of the most polluted cities in the world. And so she's showing how this Buddhist entity is sort of coming and sitting on top of this very polluted location now.
So, wow. Um, yeah, I from what I've looked at and read and researched over the past couple of months, Mongolia, I think, is one of the most beautiful places I've learned of, and to know that this is what's going on is, um, it's both sad, but also knowing that there are artists that are making work like this, um, gives me hope as well.
Yeah.
Um, I think I have one more question for you. I'm super appreciative of your time and conversation today, but um, knowing of all the work that you've done, you've been able to curate work in Venice and across the world and done some amazing things. What are you most grateful for in your life?
I'm grateful for my family. I'm very fortunate to have a very supporting family. My husband, even though he's not in art, he's always supportive of my work. We would have 3 kids, and again, none of our kids is in art, but always supportive, and that's something that helps me to do what I do and seek for new opportunities and continue my work, even though Mongolian art is so marginalized and Mongolian artists are not well known. I still hope that we will we will see the day when our museums will show this art.
I'm sure we will. I'm positive of it. Um, so I just wanted to thank you for taking some time to chat today, and I look
Mhm.
forward to continuing the conversation and sharing our conversation with our audience as well.
Yes. And if anyone is interested to read a little bit about Mongolian art or see some more images, welcome to my website, which is just simply artmongolia.org, ARTMONGOLIA, artmongolia, one word.org. And there you can see my images that I write about, or my articles, my books, and so on. I hope you will continue learning about Mongolian art.
Again, just thank you for your time. I don't want to take too much more of your time because I know we're a little bit over, but truly, I've been studying Buddhism for my entire life, since I was
Uh-huh,
a small child. And
uh-huh.
to get the opportunity to talk to someone like you is really kind of a dream come true for me. So thank you so much.
Thank you too, John. What form of Buddhism you study?
Primarily Tibetan Buddhism, but also Zen Buddhism as well. But it was mostly, or has been mostly, Tibetan Buddhism. So um, this has just been such a treat, and I was so excited to get to talk to you whenever Nanda emailed me about the opportunity. So
Yes. Thank you too, and wishing you all the best in this year in 2025.
definitely likewise. Same to you too.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Orna Soltum is a distinguished art historian specializing in Asian art with expertise in the art, culture, and history of Mongolia. As the first Mongolian curator active in the field since 1993, she has played a pioneering role in bringing our Mongolian artistic traditions to global audiences through her exhibitions, research, and writing. Her recent exhibition, Mongol Zurag, The Art of Resistance, ran from April to November of 2024 at the Venice Biennale and marks the 100th anniversary of her father's birth. This groundbreaking showcase features historical and contemporary works that highlight the resilience of Mongolian creativity against historical and political upheavals. Recognized with numerous honors, including the IU Presidential Arts and Humanities Fellowship and the College Art Association Publication Award, Dr. Soltum continues to bridge cultural divides through her forthcoming book exploring the intersection of environmental art and Mongolian cultural practices. To learn more about Orna Soltum and her remarkable work preserving and elevating Mongolian artistic traditions, visit www.artmongolia.org. That's www.artmongolia.org.
We value your thoughts and feedback. Please consider leaving us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Your feedback not only helps us grow, but also helps others find us. If today's discussion moved you or sparked a thought, please share it with us and with someone you know. You can also join our community on Instagram to continue the conversation and connect with fellow listeners at infinite.search. To delve deeper into this topic and explore additional episodes, visit our website at www.theinfinitesearch.com, where you'll find extended show notes, further readings, and a full transcript of today's episode. The Infinite Search is a heart-centered production of Chamber, a creative studio specializing in purpose-driven branding, design, and experiences for clients of every size. For more information, visit www.thisischamber.com. theatreproject.com.